Mediopolis, Chapter 20. Into the shows. The family discussion show was scheduled for the later evening, when they would all exchange, borrow, swap, share, loan and give each other ideas about the actual show and the future show directions. Childminder Lucy, the young new governess, had been preparing the food with the other kitchenettes for the wider family, and had been messaged by the mother to visit each of the children to see what they were all up to in the rooms, while she was busy talking with the older man, the other aunt visiting Aunt Tarina, and the Uncle Derek, to talk to them about the show. Lucy was sent up to visit all of the other children, to summon them to the show later, to the discussion show. She had the mother sit them on couches or chairs or on the floor, watching some programs to keep them occupied, keep them busy, to stop them squabbling with each other. When so many of them were gathered together in the same area, there was a tendency for that to happen. Yet Lucy visited each to see what they were all up to, what they were watching or listening, and how they all were, how they were watching, how they were listening. She visited each of them in their own different rooms, some of them shared together in double or twin rooms, if they were around the same age. Some were joining in with the programme itself, doing a sing-along show, where they sung along to the same words as those on the show themselves. Others seemed to be doing a shout-along show, where they had to shout the sounds, or yell out, cry out, or bleat out different sounds. Others only talked back at the programme's characters, during the silences in between the characters' monologues or dialogues or the trialogues, where they would discuss things each other. And in the silences between the character narratives, they would then have a chance to respond with their own thoughts. Whilst there was another group of children, an older group in another room, that only talked with each other about the characters and never talked back to the characters. There was no silence nor chance to respond in the programme to the characters talking. And they never talked at the characters themselves, therefore, nor at the programme itself. There was another group that was sat watching and listening silently and never talked, not at the programme nor to each other during the duration of the programme. There was a group of youths all stood up, not sat down, and they were watching one programme, and they were occasionally sighing or cheering or shouting something every now and then. Then there were a few following all the dance programmes. In their own room there was a much larger space, so they had a spacious area to try and mimic some of the character dances on the programme they watched, or that they watched parts of in between doing their movements, trying to copy the various moves of those on screen. They were long, slow dance movements, but cut into various smaller segments, various small choreographed movements that would then gradually build up, being put together in longer syntaxes, longer groups of movements. Then there was the eldest son's room that she went to visit. He was there lying on the bed, watching some show with his headphones on. No wonder it seemed so quiet in the outside of his room. Young Lucy had stopped to watch his show with him for a while, projected onto the large wall opposite them, in his room, yet struggling really to make sense of the storyline, seeing only muted characters acting in mime, with a tree collapsing silently in the background. She'd watched a group of characters on the elder son's projected screen, dressed in woodland foliage. They were all wearing these leafy costumes that had been sewn together intricately. And there were all these close-up images of the group, making a half circle together as they were stood around the camera, and around the audience themselves, making a half circle. And then all had looked behind them, the group on the projected screen, looking away from the audience, away from visiting Lucy and also the elder son, and away from all of the audience, looking beyond all the large bushes and trees that surround them, the thick green foliage, beyond the row after row of the trees, beyond a long winding path that ran through a woodland way beyond them, towards in the background where the tree itself had earlier fallen down. The half circle of men and women had broken into two groups, all turning backward, slowly, mournfully, walking away from the audience now, away from the screen, going two by two in their lines, walking along the old path, then not having time to watch them slowly meander, disappearing along into the path, until they had become just miniature people in the background. Visitor Charmander Lucy had asked what he was watching, what it was about. The oldest son, Skit at the time, had said that it was the Woodland Guru Series 7 that he was currently watching. That when a tree was felled in the series by the lumberjack, it was meant that another of the contestant disciples was going on to be chosen. There would be a choice to be made later on the show. And that the group had so far survived elimination from the reality show. It was a reality woodland show, in fact, that was based within a woodland and involved a lot of woodland professionals and woodland skills to learn and also teach within the show. They had to go as a group to collect the tree, informed the elder son. That's what they did each week, when a new person would have to be chosen. And then they would take and transport the tree as a group, carrying it, with one group lined up on one side and another lined up on the other side, all carrying it as a group back to the wooden cabin, and prepare it for the fire, and also for other uses too, stripping it of its many branches and also its many foliage to dry it out in preparation, and have it all chopped up into smaller pieces where they would axe it later, which could be used for carpentry and for the various carpentry challenges over the next week, after it had been fully dried out. For the next week, they would probably use the earlier fallen wood that had been chopped up earlier in the weeks before. The original Woodland Guru had won against other woodland guides in a competitive show last year. Season 6, the elder son had informed her that she'd not heard much about the actual woodland show. They'd had to build a wooden cabin for the show themselves. It was a show where they all had to live inside the cabin then, together, and were filmed, both constructing the cabin and then later living within it themselves. Where the winner, he and a few of the other runner-up Woodland Gurus, would then work together, and the three of them that managed to survive endured the public voting the longest. The three that survived the longest through the voting, they were having to then build the wooden house at the end that would ultimately grow to accommodate a small hamlet of 12 people that would be the finalists to live in the Woodland series for the Woodland show itself. And that because it was a traditional number for some reason, that's why they allowed it. Only one of those Woodland Gurus, however, of the 12, who would be mentored by the new Woodlanders themselves, only one of them would survive for next season's show in the Battle of the Gurus, said the elder son, trying to explain it all, where the Woodland Guru and his 12 friends, as a group, then would have to compete in cross-climatic studies and cross-climatic struggles between the Desert Gurus and his family of a group, and a mountain guru and his folk. There would also be a farming guru and his workers, an urban city guru and his gang, and all those other would-be winners and their respective competition shows. There were a number of others that were considered to be potential performers as well within it, who hadn't yet been decided on though. They would all be taken to the show island eventually for the Ultimate Series 8 next year, where the 5 gurus that had been confirmed so far, but possibly it was rumoured that there could be 6 or 7 different groups, they would all have to work together as a unit with their own group, struggling to survive and to sustain each other and to provide their essential needs within this island. Better than the other groups they would have to sustain and thrive, whilst the audience viewers would be watching them and also voting as the weeks gone by, watching their highlights and also many of the lowlights too, where they would get to vote on who they thought it was better to stay in for the group. It would be the struggle of the 5 elemental gurus it was being billed as so far, although there were potentially 6 or 7 groups that could be considered. That was still rumoured and not yet confirmed, though. Although there was still a discussion about choosing what island would be perfect for the actual location of the island reality show that had little of all the climatic conditions so that all of the elemental groups could all have something beneficial and also a challenge to meet too. Something that would feature something that would suit and benefit all of the climatic groups. They would all have an abandoned island that they could go to, like released animals being let out somehow. And those animals that would be released there could as well be used. Either they could farm them or capture them or hunt them, or that they could use them in some way, befriend them as animal husbanders might do, or that they could just defend their home from them and make sure that they were clear. As well as there being the people that would be released there too, and that would allow them to bring some simple tools with them for creating this new potential village for the few months that the show would be filmed, over the course of the summer months that it would be aired. There would be a few dilapidated old buildings in the shelter, things that they could adapt and reuse themselves, potentially older buildings that had been left to crumble, that had long outgrown their use a long time ago, potentially, and a few older buildings, new buildings that could be put there, basic shelters that could be used in harder weathers if there was bad weather, that all of them potentially, all of the 5 elemental guru groups could all shelter into as a large collective in case there ever was really bad weather and a bad storm, unforeseen by weather forecasters perhaps. At least there was a basic shelter that they could all cram within and put aside, hopefully, whatever disagreements may have built up over the days and weeks and potentially few months that the show would air. But apart from that basic shelter that didn't have any real doors or windows and was missing whole sides of parts of the building too, there were just the old dilapidated, rotten, broken through parts of the buildings that could be mended and adapted with a lot of effort and work, potentially. But just lots of sparse areas of trees and woodland and rough scrubland, a wild grassland, and there were also areas of coastal paths with also coastal rugged lands, and there were also rough, rugged arable land that grew very little as well. Arid, desert-like land that covered much of the island also. This was thought to be the island that was being chosen, though it hadn't really been shown in its full yet. Only glimpses and images of it had been shown to the audience, just teasing visual glimpses of it to encourage people to consider watching it perhaps. There were the old shelters, in case the bad weather might happen, just as an insurance or precaution. And then there was one house that was a very small house that could potentially home one of the potential groups, though there would really not be enough room for any more of them. Potentially, if 2 of the groups squeezed in and could work together, complementary, 2 of the groups could fit in well. But certainly not 3 or 4, and never 5. There just wouldn't be the room for it with a very limited number of smaller rooms. So there was one very small house, functional, with lots of kitchens, bathrooms, and heating facilities too, however very small that was, that would never accommodate large numbers of people, and would actually be a squash for just one of the small groups of the 13 members to fit within. Still, the conditions were set up in that manner to find out what would happen with those 5 different groups trying to work within themselves and to adapt both to the other groups they'd be working and struggling with, and also to the island and the island's conditions too, all being shown as it was advertised for the audience themselves, with great excitement still being bred, as who knew who would be going on to the show, as that would be the prequel to the shows that were still being aired now. And according to how those shows went, that would decide who and what contestants would qualify to go on to the later Series 8 of the Guru Series Challenges show, and the ultimate Battle of the Gurus Island show for Series 8 next year. There was great anticipation of that, the elder son had assured childminder Lucy, trying to tell her all about that he was interested in it, and they'd watched a flash of some of the adverts for next year's potential summer show, the Elemental Guru Summer Show, as it was being billed as, though some were still debating whether there could really be 6 or 7 elemental groups performing within the show. Only 5 had really been confirmed within the adverts, and only 5 series were being aired through the course of the year before, through the spring, summer, autumn, and winter seasons. Those 4 groups that are qualified, and then there was one other group, and their show would be aired throughout the 4 seasons, making up the 5th elemental group that would go on to the season 8 of the Ultimate Elemental Guru Battle Show, where they would struggle against each other on the island show of the group. Lucy didn't think it looked so much fun, to be honest, watching the Woodland Guru show that was only season 6. She'd never really watched any of the other 5 seasons before, so knew nothing about what had led up to the current show. It didn't look too much fun, she commented. It looked a hard challenge, in fact, to her. Yet said it did sound like they were learning at least traditional skills, perhaps. But she questioned just how relevant it was in this new technological age to build a traditional house in traditional methods, with carpentry, with thatching and weaving, and to have traditional methods also of gathering in and of textiles and of sewing and all the other traditional methods. Why, with industrial and technological processes, was that really necessary even? But still, it was interesting to learn such traditional skills, and perhaps there was a niche market still that could be relevant for some particular thing. Still, it was interesting to watch in some way, despite how relevant it might not be to the wider job market in itself. Interesting to watch people trying to catch their own dinner, or to gather it in, or to scavenge and forage as well, and to learn how to do it, though it wasn't sure how often and how relevant that would be. Surely there were better ways of dealing with it with modern machinery and technology. Yet she saw nothing wrong in watching it. No, it seemed to be fascinating, and she watched it with the young son for quite a while, having some time off between the visits. Relaxed and assured that many of the other children were occupied and being looked after by the elder children, and they seemed quite content so far in their various activities, in watching, listening, performing, miming, shouting, and singing along with various programs. And she watched a group of men on the Woodland Guru series show, a group of men and a few women, who were showing the new potential disciple around the woodland cabin, showing them the new wooden table and the wooden chairs, the shelves, the wooden ornaments that they'd been sculpting over the weeks gone by already, showing them proudly around the wooden house, and also showing them all the leafy foliage of their different costumes and the textiles that they created too, and all the different clothes that they'd foraged and scavenged, and a few of the things they'd gathered in, all the different collections of vegetables and all the store food cupboards that they showed them excitedly almost, as if they were quite proud of their achievements over the last month and a half or so, as the group had slowly gathered and grown in numbers. And the amount of wooden furniture, tables, chairs, and beds, shelves, cupboards, they'd all grown too, as well as all the different ornamental structures, the clothing, the furniture, all sewn and woven, and all the wooden baskets that had been woven out of the different pliable wood that had been weaven together. And they showed them the different woven baskets, as well as the leafy costumes and the leafy blankets as well, and as well as all the food supplies that were kept in stock. And the new potential members of the show, the new participants, were shown around with great intrigue, looking around in wonder at the wooden and leafy cabins. And they looked around it as they were toured round. And then there were all the animal furs and all the hides that the tanner on the show themselves were still in the process of making up, showing them some of the tanner's processes in curing the furs of the animals that they'd been able to catch. And there were a number of those that were being treated and still in part of the chemical process. The tanner was showing them some of the various stages of those and giving long talks about that. He'd joined and been voted in a couple of weeks back. Strong middle-aged man, gruffly spoken, but had a nice appeal about him too. He spoke at length, concisely though, about the different processes involved within his profession, and how it was having to be adjusted according to the needs and the different things he'd had to bring in with him to make it essential, and how he'd had to adapt that within the show itself. Then they were shown some of the still drying out, those that were draped around the house, hanging off various wooden banisters and hanging off all sorts of wooden shelves, propped up awkwardly here and there. And they admired them, the new potential contestants, looking around at all the potential new costumes that they might wear. The costumes of many potential leaves that were hung off and drying up everywhere, of all different shapes and sizes, and that each of them, of course, were all wearing too, with long garlands of leaves strung around their necks. There were even pretty flower garlands in their hair too, and that were woven around from the plants themselves during the earlier weeks, of course, with many different styles of leaves that were wound together and that were woven, intricately knitted together. They were sewed together in all different lengths and sizes. There was branches and bits of sawdust and leaves all over the place, cluttering all over the floors, the entrances, the pathways. They were wading through it in some parts around the actual outbuildings of the house. Piles of it, even littering around the lounge and kitchen areas and the relaxing areas where they all sat on the stumps of old trees and segments of the trees cut and sawn, axed into parts long ago, where they all balanced, relaxing on these groups, with the clutter of the branches, fallen debris of the leaves scattered all around them. Evidently, cleaning wasn't really a top agenda for them over the last week or so. Embarrassingly, someone had snapped the costume off one of the potential participants, trying to then retie a loose hemp rope that they'd been wearing that had unravelled during a warm embrace when they'd all tried to embrace as a group together in some quick, chaotic embrace. Seeing it then fall apart, several of the nearest participants and residents of the woodland cabin had all clutched at at bushy branches quickly, then holding the thick foliage out quickly to spare the new arrivals blushes. And apart from that, they'd really been trying to talk about some serious challenges that they'd been facing over the last week. What with the much colder weather, with the summer season progressing now into all early autumn in the Woodland Challenge, with wetter, colder, and also darker nights that have been creeping up on them gradually. But a lot of wet downpours that they've been getting through, leaks in the wooden cabin, and muddy, slippery slopes along the pathways leading down to it too. Discussing all of that to the new participants, but they all reeked out and hackled with laughter, shrieked almost, when the collapsed leaf foliage happened, and the embarrassment was only brief, a mere glimpse for a few moments. But that changed the serious discussion, and they were all able to have a little light-hearted laugh just for a moment, despite the brief expose that was only a little embarrassing. They've been discussing how they were all more exposed now to the recent heavy rainfall, and they really couldn't rely on the nearby towering trees that they had done so a few months earlier, or even though it was only 6 or 7 weeks earlier, that had once sheltered them from the heavier downpours in this tropical woodland resort, because the leaves then had had a much thicker leaf foliage in their long branches, because so few of them had fallen. But now it was early to mid-autumn, they really didn't provide the coverage, and so much of the thick downpours, even under those giant trees nearby, got through and wet patches were running everywhere. So it was important to make sure the woodland cabin was much more sealed up, and that the thatched roof wouldn't mend itself, said one of the other visiting woodland gurus, commenting that still needed a lot more work in many of the areas. One of the other visiting woodland gurus had gone around inspecting the thatched roof, looking at where it still needed a lot of work doing to it, with the other group of woodlanders and the survival experts also doing their weekly assessment, looking back over the video footage of the various activities. And they gave their weekly assessment, giving advice to the current guru and all the different participants, and those whose directions that they were following. The group of expert woodlanders, who were experts in various professions, in carpentry, in tannering, in weaving, thatchering, in animal husbandry even, in hunting, in gathering, scavenging, in foraging, and in woodland work in general too, as well as in a host of many other skills. Some of them, there was a herbalist who'd been invited and had been voted in to join in, and also a specialist in nutrition and in food science also. And there was also a show presenter who confronted the group with many questions, and then also invited and allowed the public watching to join in and ask their own questions too. Although people seemed as interested in just the people and how they got on with each other, as much as the actual climate and the situation and the woodlands and all the different professions themselves. So some of the discussions were more serious and focused on their actual abilities, the professions, and the type of skills that they were learning. But others were much more informal and casual and social, and were more actually about the relations between the various participants and how they'd been getting on and their different personal relationships that had developed and changed over the weeks. People seemed interested in how different people were getting along. People of different temperaments, different ages, genders, sexualities, races, religions, people with different political views, and people of different philosophical views too. How they got on working, playing, living, and struggling together. Some had watched the show for an interest in specifically the woodlands and the woodland skills and crafts too. Yet it was in seeing them work together with their housemates and live with their colleagues that seemed to make it a much more interesting show for many, not just the watching them out at work during the actual work activities themselves. That was one part of the show, the work woodland show, but then there was also the home woodland show that was connected but had a more later evening feel about it rather than a daytime feel. So there were 2 or 3 different shows, but all connected to a one woodland show itself. The work woodland show, the home woodland show, and then the social fun woodland show for the later night. A day, an evening, and a night woodland show. It was broken up into 3 segments, although they were all related and called as simply the one woodland show, that incorporated all 3 in just one show in a morning recap highlight of the previous 3 evening, daytime, and nighttime shows together. There were those interested in just watching one part of the show, and those in a couple, and those that were interested in all 3, or watched just the one incorporated show that included all 3 shows within a bigger show. That's what made the Guru series interesting. The elder son had informed Lucy after a long chat about it all, saying that people followed the series not because they were necessarily into the woodland work or those activities themselves. They could just watch the woodland work show if that's all they wanted and were interested in learning those specific woodland activities, skills, and in how to learn traditional skills that could be adapted for their own needs. But others that were just more interested in how the woodlanders lived socially within the woodland house, or interested in the woodland personal relationships, watched those shows. Then there were the desert shows, the modern city shows as well, and there were others that followed those, that were similar shows and had a similar format to the woodland work shows and the woodland home shows, and also the woodland social shows as well. The Woodland Guru show, as it was, with the other woodland participants, had also the modern city guru shows, the desert guru show, the mountain guru show, and all the other elemental shows that were building up for the climatic elemental island show of next year. Many followed it for the personal working, living together relationships, although others did watch only for just one series because they were interested in learning about woodland living alone. Some were just interested in learning only about desert living and how to survive in that kind of environment. Or some were just interested in street living and how to survive in a street and that kind of thing, and not in the actual how people had personal relationships in that environment. People could choose to watch different parts or elements of the show that more interested their needs or their interests. Before they could all get on the Islanders show, the ultimate struggle of the elemental teachers, as it was being billed as in one of the adverts, they were still having to go through the local competitive shows that they would have to get through in their own elemental world, with the survival woodland teacher and his woodlander group having to compete against other woodland teachers and their respective groups too. Members of the public were selected to visit and tour the woodland cabin, the woodland house, the tree house, the old den, the woodlands, the warrens, and the 5 different places to stay in for a weekend. Members of the public could visit if they were chosen to and selected. When they went to live in the residential woodlands building or the residential woodland habitat, they would then try and cater for their needs. And these people did that during the tour. They would then give their feedback and vote and decide, giving it through a live stream video that the audience could watch and hear their own views, hear other members of society's views, and then they could decide whose woodland place that they all preferred living in, rating it themselves in terms of its comfort, its appeal, and how much they had also learnt from the experience and how much they enjoyed the woodland school on the woodland house that they'd visited. Would they recommend it to others, for example? How much would they be prepared to pay for it? They would decide if the activities were suitable for their particular group. The woodland group hosting them would be told the demographic of the group that would be visiting them, their type of age, their abilities, and their needs, that they would have to adjust the woodland habitat towards as part of the challenge of the public tours. That would be a new part of the series that hadn't been done in the previous series. Each new series had to have a new twist, a new shock, a new sensation, a new element to it. All the woodlanders knew it had to be a livable, workable space that would be functional for the touring visitors, the members of the public, people that chose to go on there, that could easily ring up and select themselves, and that would be chosen for those that were most qualified from a random selection. All those that were deemed to be qualified, that had specialist interest in that particular type of show, they would be especially chosen and selected. And then there would be random members of the public too that could be chosen from selected lists that people could enter into also, as well as those that were qualified and had some specialist interest within that field. And there were others that were chosen too, through what was known through the random woodland lottery that would be featured at the end of the show, where random members of the public could be chosen and they could cut straight to a live feed of seeing their reaction of them being selected and invited to a woodland tour of the 5 respective woodland habitats within the woodland shows. The woodland lottery would go on each week, selecting vast numbers. Hundreds of people would be chosen for the woodland tours, with all the funds of the woodland lottery going towards a number of conservation projects to help promote woodland conservation and ecological biodiversity within the woodland habitats, claimed the programme of the woodland lottery that would be shown at the end of the woodland shows. Only 3 balls had to be matched to win a chance to go on to the woodland show out of the 10 guesses of the 10 numbers of the 50 numbers that would be selected. So thousands and thousands would get to go on the show, if only for a brief weekend visit and a tour of the 5 homes, respectively. There were a few people that managed to match much more of the balls that were lucky enough to go on for several week longer stays. And there were vast amounts of people that would get to go and visit just for a day, where they could go and visit for a few hours in each of the woodland habitats. It was a new project to involve members of the public watching it, so that many of them could be participants within the show itself and giving their feedback on the show, their own ratings of the show, to other members of the public and the audience watching. They would then become parts of the show themselves, if they were qualified or got through and were selected through the woodland lottery itself. There were a number of touring positions that were also reserved for local woodlanders, people that lived nearby the actual woodland habitat itself, to compensate themselves for all the inconvenience for the large group of people that would be camped out living nearby in their local villages and their towns, that will be camped out there in order to help with the production. Editors, journalists, those that were intrigued, and those that were visiting and that were part of the production team too. Local habitat visitors, residents of the local woodland towns and villages that were invited onto the show to compensate themselves for any inconvenience caused to living so nearby the show. And all the 5 retired guru teachers, winners of the past 5 years, they would all stay in the last year's Woodland Show winning house. The show that was called The Bushes. That was a woodland home surrounded by large bushes that were all wildly overgrown on the outside, that had just been cut back within it. They were shaped in a circle that surrounded a large spacious area that had all grown so wild on the outside it. Since last year's series, it had been left that way to grow even wilder than it had been before. And many of the planted trees, to add to where the gaps in the bushy walls had now been growing out wilder themselves, creating one giant wall of bushes, with long bushy branches grown up and grown out in every direction. The pathway to the old guru of the woodland house had been cleared of fallen branches, leaves swept aside, and the bushes overhanging the woodland door all cut back, trimming the fringe of the doorway itself. And there inside the old bushy building, what was now, it looked like one giant bush, but inside there was a large space and lots of room for those people to gather within and have all their instruments, a small table, lots of chairs, where no one actually stayed overnight, but they did the filming, where they could look at the different shows and they could watch the other woodlanders' shows and in their woodland habitat, and even speak to them through the video shows themselves. Though this was really a large circle of them. The show presenter and a cameraman could gather within them. The past winners and even a few runners-up of the Forest Teaching School had all gathered into the old bush building, the old bush tree house, as it was last year's winner. They had all gathered in, an hour or two's scrambling through the muddy tracks onto the first of the competitive woodland homes. It was a long scramble up those muddy tracks to the first of the house, while they did their own tour, leaving last year's winner's house, the old giant bush, to begin their weekly woodland ramble that they would do each week. Many of the teachers of the woodlands found it much of a challenge to ramble so far and over so much difficult terrain, often clambering, climbing, and even trying to climb over and around different branches, scrambling, navigating over swampish, muddy areas, even under branches. The older woodland teachers had to do so fortnightly tours and sometimes weekly tours to give their feedback in looking and assessing at the different connected habitats that had been gradually created and adapted over the weeks. Inside, filming and reviewing in the big bush house from the remote monitor watching show, like just another audience member, as if they were. Yet they were all sat there looking back and connecting to the others that they could occasionally talk to. Yet they could talk to them and hear them talk back through a telephone and the televisuals too. It was different back in his day, long ago. One of the old woodland gurus, the old woodland teachers had said, they hadn't had to prepare the straw houses or wooden houses, and they had never had any such tourers, never had those sorts of things. And one of the other woodland teachers said, of course, they always had, in his day, to build the wooden house or straw house